My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Part 2. In the first conversation, you kind of ended more or less chatting to me about Constantine and the weaponization of the church, and how Christianity, which was this very small religious system in Rome, how it became the state religion quite quickly. And you referred to it as state terrorism, 337 AD onwards, where you stated that Christians became deadlier to each other than wild beasts.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot who said that. One of the very few pagan, I use the word pagan, but, as we explained yesterday, nobody called themselves pagans, but, it's difficult to find a term, we should say non-Christian. Traditionalist would be the good term, actually, because at that time they felt they were traditionalists. They were resisting against a revolutionary movement. Christianity was perceived as a revolutionary movement, and it was in many ways. Michael Jones would not like Christianity to be called a Jewish revolutionary movement, but it was really. Although,
hang on. To be fair, though, Michael Jones is a Catholic, and the Catholic position tends to be quite different.
But early Christianity started as a kind of when it became a message to the Gentiles, it was a revolutionary movement. And you can feel that even in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus say, whoever doesn't reject his father and mother is not worthy of me. This kind of thing was very revolutionary in a way. But of course, Christianity is a very complex thing. And as it became the state religion, then of course it became, once a revolution succeeds, it's not anymore a revolutionary movement, it's a state. It became a state religion, and little by little it became conservative rather than revolutionary. And as you said, in fact, it can be assumed that Constantine chose Christianity, well, probably as Peter Heather assumes, because he was Christian. That's I think Peter Heather is one of the best contemporary historian of late antiquity. And he comes with the idea that Christianity before Constantine was, only 2% of the people living in the Roman Empire were Christians. That's maybe an extremely low evaluation, but it's probably reasonable. If we, of course, in the cities, it might have been 10% or even 20%, maybe in Antioch or Alexandria, possibly. But then after Constantine, it became a state religion. And then the enemy, as you know, the enemy were the pagans. But, let's say after Theodosius, at the very end of the 4th century, there were not so many pagans anymore, except in the countryside, but that didn't, the hierarchy, the state did not really bother too much about country people. What they wanted is to convert the aristocracy, the senatorial, the urban population. So as the pagans disappeared, of course, the church found enemies within itself, and the enemy became the heretics. This was already the case, in fact, from the very beginning of Christianity. The history of Christianity is a history of sectarian strife between different understanding of what Jesus was about and so on. This was not a new phenomena, but what was new is that the state power was involved now to combat what was not the imperial orthodoxy. There was an imperial orthodoxy, and then there were people who were not considered in line with the orthodoxy, and they were persecuted. But the strange thing, the complicated thing is that actually And that's a very little known story, but very interesting because it connects with the Germans, barbarians, and so on, because Constantine basically convened the Nicene Council of Nicaea in 325. He wanted unity of the church, so he asked all the bishops to come there and agree on some kind of statement, and stop bickering about, doctrinal difference, and let's all agree about something. And, he was not a theologian. He just wanted a unified church because for him, the church, it was part of the unity of the empire. That was part of his policy, his religious policy, which was not a new religious policy. In fact, the emperors had always, let's say from the the 3rd century at least, they were always struggling to find some kind of religious unity, So there were different attempts, but finally Constantine settled for Christianity and he wanted a unified church, so he convened the Council of Nicaea, and they all signed a creed, which is called the Nicene Creed, which in fact what we call today the Nicene Creed was not exactly the creed that was signed there. It was it was completed later, but basically it stated against Arius, against the heretics of the time who were resisting against the full identification of Jesus and God. It stated, no, Jesus is God, the same substance of God. The Son and the Father are the same substance, and they use a Greek term, homoousios, which means same substance. Okay, so apparently, most people were satisfied, but in fact not. And probably a lot of bishops felt they had been bullied into signing this. They were not satisfied with it, and there were a lot of resentment against it. And then Constantine himself started to feel uncomfortable with it because the main promoter of that creed was Athanasius of Alexandria, and Constantine really became fed up with this man who was really a fanatic, and he exiled him. He was exiled 5 times. He exiled him as far as possible from Alexandria because he was the bishop of Alexandria. He was not yet the bishop at the time of the council, but he became bishop 3 years later. And he always fought for this creed. That was his child, this creed. Father and son are homoousios. That was his obsession. But a lot of people were not happy with it because it was not a term coming from the gospel. It had nothing to do with the gospel. So people felt, let's settle for more, vague and compromising formula that makes everybody happy. Some people don't like this formula because it sounds like Jesus is God, and some people don't like it. They feel the Son of God is good enough, So Constantine himself, at the end of his life, renounced that formula and settled for the formula that was proposed by more, let's say, moderate Christians like Eusebius of Nicomedia. Yeah, Eusebius of Nicomedia, not to be confused with Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a moderate and settled for vague terms, saying the Father and the Son are alike. They are similar to each other. Vague enough, everybody can, understand it the way they want. And of course, the enemies of that call this Arianism. But it was not Arianism. There was no reference to Arius. Arius was, resisting very strongly against identifying the Son and the Father. But the new Homoian creed, we call it Homoian because homoios means same, similar, So anyway, that became the orthodoxy, the Imperial orthodoxy at the very end of Constantine's life.
Sorry, Laurent, but this is what you're talking about right now is very fundamental to Christianity.
It is, yeah. It is, of course. And it's that's why it's not known, because it's disturbing, because Constantine himself renounced we can call it the Trinitarian creed, because, the Nicene Christian, they considered themselves Trinitarians. And the others were uncomfortable with the Trinity, one God in 3 persons. They were not comfortable. So we could call it.
It's not even biblical, actually.
No, of course not. It has nothing. That was the point. They felt, where is it in the gospel? Jesus is God. No, he said nobody knows. He clearly said, he never said I'm God. He often said, of course, he said all kinds of different things, or we made him say all kinds of different things. But basically, the point of the people who said Jesus, we cannot call Jesus God. It makes no sense. They had a point, at least. They had a good point.
I mean, and he also said nobody comes to the Father but through me.
Yeah, he said that.
And when he was on the cross, he cried out to God.
Yeah, of course, he talked to God. So if he was God, why would he talk to himself? I mean, and he even said, I forgot exactly where and exactly what he said, but nobody knows but the Father, So some things he didn't know himself. So anyway, of course, we can debate, about what Jesus said, what he didn't say, and so on. But basically, it was logical that many people felt uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus is God. But the idea that Jesus is God comes from, it comes from a Jewish monotheistic obsession. There must be only one God. So if Jesus is not God, then it sounds like there are two gods now. That's not good, So one God, that's the obsession of the monotheist tradition. That was the obsession. And in fact...
it almost sounds blasphemous, what you're saying.
Well, for me, not, because I don't consider myself Christian. As I said, I have a deep...
I know that. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, so somebody who is a Christian listening to this will go, wow, that sounds very blasphemous. But what you're talking about actually is history.
Yeah, it's history, it's people's opinions, I mean, nobody heard God say, people may hear voices in their head, but that's possible, but, nobody can say for sure if it's God. So, for me, it's just opinions of people who get a little bit hubristic in their feeling that they know what God thinks, they know what God says. This is in fact a little bit grotesque from a rational viewpoint. But the funny thing, if I want to finish the story because it's interesting, is that Constantine so renounced and settled for the moderate creed Homoian, which was condemned as Arianism, and most historians following the church historians call them Arianist or Arians, which they were not. They never called them. They never referred to Arius. And then Constantine's son also continued in that tradition. So for, let's say, 40 years, almost 40 years, the Imperial orthodoxy of the emperors, Constantine's son, and then after there was Valens and Valentinian, they also continued the same tradition. The Imperial orthodoxy was not the Nicene Trinitarian Creed, was the Homoian Creed that say Jesus and God are different. Well, they're similar, but, so that's similar, that's all. Implicitly rejecting the idea that they are identical. Similar being, different from identical of the same substance. And that's the period when the Goth, the first Germans, barbarians to be converted, that's the period they were converted, as part of a diplomatic agreement for some of the Goths to settle in the Roman territory. They were pushed around by the Huns, and they were in trouble, so they got permission to settle, but at the condition of adopting Roman values, which at that time was already including Christianity. So they became Christian, and what kind of Christianity? Of course, the Christianity of the emperor of that time. So they became Homoian Christians. And for some reason, which is partly mysterious, all the German tribes or nations, which were kind of most were not really, were big artificial nations, federation of different tribes. They also converted to the same Homoian creed. One of the reasons is that one bishop under Valens had translated for them the Bible and had given and had made for them a script for their language, the first writing alphabet for German. So, they were happy to have an alphabet, they were happy to have their scriptures, and they were also probably happy to have a creed that did not identify completely Jesus with God, because they were used to have divine men who die and resurrect and become gods in heaven. This was probably more comfortable for them, because in this case, Jesus is almost like a hero in the Greek sense. He's a half god, born, with a divine father, and he dies, but he resurrects. That's Greek mythology, and that was also part of the German religious landscape. So probably they were happy with it, and they resisted strongly against converting back to Nicene Christianity when finally the emperor Theodosius, or before him Gratian and Theodosius, so that was in 380 something, then decided, no, let's go back to Nicene Creed, the absolute monotheistic creed. And then Theodosius was the first, in the Christianization of the Roman Empire, Constantine is the first important person. The second one is Theodosius, who was fanatically Christian and fanatically Nicene Trinitarian Christian, and therefore a persecutor not only of the pagans, but then persecutor also of the Homoians, Christians, whom he called Arians. We always have to most people know them as Aryan or Aryanist. Most people think all the German tribes were Aryanist. In fact, they were not. That's it's not the correct term. Peter Heather made that point. They were not Aryanist. Most very recent historians explain they were not Aryanist. They were called Aryanist as a way to assimilate them to a guy who had been condemned as a heretic. But anyway, so that's an interesting story, because then there was, on top of the civil wars between Christians and pagans, which lasted, I talked last time about the Battle of the Frigidus, that was in 382 under Theodosius. So Theodosius was both fighting against the pagans and fighting against the German heretics somehow.
I apologize for jumping in again. I just want to make sure that I'm following. So you were pointing out now that Theodosius basically ended the what did you refer to it as, the Hellenic world?
Oh, also, yeah. Well,
and that was around what, 380 AD.
Yeah, Theodosius 380. He had a quite long reign, and then his son reigned, and so the Theodosian dynasty. Forgot exactly how long it lasted. And but there is a third important stage in the Christianization. First stage is Constantine, then the second major stage is Theodosius. Theodosius really went hard against the pagans. He actually he wrote laws to condemn a penalty of death for any kind of even pagan rituals, even in your home. Even worshipping your ancestors would be condemned by death, even if you do it at home and you are denounced by your neighbors. So there was a whole, it was very intense, it was a Bolshevik system. You could be denounced by your own neighbors for practicing, for having your little your little ancestors of clay, or your little altar for the Lares and the Penat, all these traditional household gods and this kind of thing. So not only he closed the temples, but he forbade. So he went very hard. But he did not yet really, as I said, I have to correct myself. He didn't really persecute the heretics yet. That came at the third stage, and that was more the Gothic wars of Justinian. So Justinian is the final stage of the Christianization, which is the stage where even the heretics, the barbarian Christians, who were not monotheistic enough, became persecuted. And that was the war, the Gothic war, was when Justinian, went against the Gothic kingdom of Theodoric, after Theodoric's death. And in fact, according to some historians today, that was the real fall of the Roman Empire, because the Gothic kingdom of Italy, so Italy was an Ostrogothic kingdom, and then in Spain and Gaul they were the Visigoth. They were sometimes quarreling, but basically they had the same religion, same language, same tradition. They were still very Roman. They were full Roman. They were trying to be Roman as Roman as they could be. From the point of view of law, architecture, literature, so the Roman Empire might not have been completely 100% called the Western Roman Empire because Theodoric refused to call himself emperor. But according to recent historians like Peter Heather, or there's one guy called Jonathan Arnold, it was still the Roman tradition, the Roman civilization, the Roman order in the West. That's in 560. So Justinian, who is considered in standard historiography as the emperor who restored for a short time the unity of the empire, in fact, he is a destroyer of the Western Roman Empire, under the pretext of reuniting it, under the pretext of a religious war, because in fact, it was mostly a religious war. He went to war against all the Western kingdoms who were fully Roman, but they were not Nicene Christians. They were Homoian Christians. They had a different kind of Christianity, softer kind, with a church we don't know much about because the winners write history, so the losers don't get to explain their case. So we don't know much about the Homoian church, but we know it was less structured, more localized, more also integrated with the political world. And so Justinian destroyed the Western Roman world, according to the vision of Peter Heather, Jonathan Arnold, and a few others now who have a revisionist vision of late antiquity.
So just to make sure that I'm following, it wasn't the barbarian invasions that would have ended the Roman Empire, but rather that the Roman Empire had already been weakened by Christianity.
Yeah, that's a very important debate today. But more and more, there has been different tendencies. The traditional vision was the barbarians destroyed the Roman civilization. That was the traditional vision. Then there was a tendency to say, well, the barbarians did not really invade. They just migrated and they settled. Of course, they caused a little bit trouble, but that was not the case. That was not the major cause of the collapse. The Roman Empire collapsed because of internal weaknesses and so on. But now there's more and more historians who understand that, the Roman Empire collapsed because of internal conflict, which were basically the civil wars. And even Peter Brown, who is considered the greatest historian, or the pioneer historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, he now comes to this conclusion: the civil wars caused the greatest damage to the Roman order. And of course, it combined with the barbarian invasion, and it combined in a way that actually those emperors who fought against each other used barbarians. So that was, the first barbarians, they were almost armed, militarized, because they were not military people, they were agricultural people. They started to become warrior people as mercenaries for Rome. So, these civil wars transformed the barbarians into a military power, which, of course, once they were armed and independent, of course, they had their own agenda to find the land, to settle, and so on. But the civil wars played a very, very important role. And as we said last time, most of those civil wars, if you look into detail, had a strong religious motive. That was not, of course, the only motive. That's not the only motive for one emperor for one general to want to be emperor, of course, but there was always a very strong religious motive in the civil wars. And of course, particularly in this famous battle, which should be a major event in the history of the fall of the Roman Empire, but is a little bit not very well known because it's the Battle of the Frigidus, as I mentioned again. It was basically a battle between Theodosius and a Roman emperor, Eugenius, who was not, we think he was basically Christian, but he was a Christian who wanted to allow paganism, allow people to continue to worship whatever they wanted. So he was, his general was Argobast, was a pagan, and it was really a revolt, a rebellion of the pagan, especially the Roman aristocracy, which was still in majority traditionalist, as I said, against Christianity. So it was really a religious war, very, very, very clearly. And the funny thing about it is that at that time, the Goths under Alaric were Christians. So it was a religious war where the emperor was using barbarian Christians against Roman pagans. So in fact, the Roman Empire was fighting Romans by using barbarians. That shows, and the barbarians were decisive in winning the battle. That's why Alaric, that's the explanation why Alaric turned against Rome, because he felt he won the battle, but he didn't get the credit for it. So that's the whole background of finally Alaric turning against Rome. And that's kind of shift a little bit our vision of what's going on.
What do you think was the decisive turning point in the collapse of Rome? I mean, or shall we say of the Hellenic religion?
Well, there's different ways to look at it. If we look at what happened in the East, we can say there was never a fall of the Roman Empire until 1453, right? Because the Byzantine, what we call the Byzantine Empire, was in fact the Roman Empire. The Byzantines never call themselves Byzantine, they call themselves Roman.
Hold on. And also there's a distinction to be made here, because people will say, yes, but there was the Roman Republic and there was the Empire, and there was a difference.
Well, yeah, of course. That happened in the before Christ, actually. Augustus, that was the beginning of the Roman Empire. We can put it around 30 before Christ somehow. That was a major shift, major change. But we should never forget that Rome remained a republic. Never stopped being a republic. It became a republic and an empire, both. Because in the Roman Empire, in fact, every city was a republic. So it's kind of ambiguous, because Rome as a city never stopped being a republic. That's why they kept this SPQR, Senatus Populus, they were still a republic with a senate in Rome. Then Constantine created a new Rome with a new Senate. But there were also other cities, which some of them had a Senate, others had a council. They were all a republic with a constitution. So, this term republic is ambiguous, because Rome itself as a city remained a republic. And the Senate of Rome had also more responsibility than just the city of Rome. They were still supposedly the head of the whole empire, but in practice there was competition between the Senate and the emperor, and the emperor little by little reduced the power of the Senate. But and of course in that process of Rome becoming an empire, it becomes strange, because then the Romans in 200 and something, the Emperor Caracalla decided any free man living in the Roman Empire is a Roman citizen. Until that time, a Roman citizen is a person living in Rome, or at least born in Rome, or at least having citizenship of the city of Rome. And then suddenly, everybody living in the Roman Empire became a Roman citizen. So that created, of course, a dual identity of Rome that completely changed everything. And when we say Romans today, of course, we think not necessarily of people living in the city of Rome, but living anywhere. So, Yeah, but Rome was an empire, and that's what we're concerned about. Of course, if it had not becoming an empire, just remained just a city, we wouldn't be talking about it. It became an empire, it became a civilization, it became... and it became two empires because it had always a dual identity, Latin in the West, Greek speaking in the East. And the Greek-speaking part of the empire had kept a very strong notion that they were not only Roman, they were Roman, but they were also the heirs of Hellenistic civilization. And they mixed up those two notions. They called Alexander the Great, they thought he was a Roman, because for them Roman meant Greek and Greek philosophy, Greek science, and so on. And an important point which answers your question before is that in the East, there was never such a break between Christianity and Hellenistic culture. The Byzantine, there were different tendencies, but basically those who won the conflict in the East, some Patriarch of Constantinople were very attached to Greek philosophy. They preserved it. They created libraries to keep it. And so in the East, there was always tension, but still coexistence between Christianity and Hellenism, which did not exist in the West because the West was not Hellenistic, was Roman, was Latin, and Greek culture kind of was a bit foreign. And so that's why the Byzantine Empire is something very different in spirit. Of course, some emperors like Justinian, whom we just mentioned, closed the Academy of Plato. So there was also some emperors were, at war against Hellenism. But if we look globally, then they preserved Hellenistic culture, and that's why we got it back in the West during the Renaissance. All this came back to the West. Plato came back to the West because the Byzantine had preserved it. Otherwise, until the Renaissance, we had only one book of Plato. We didn't know much about Plato. So, yeah, that's the big picture.
You describe the Old Testament as a Jewish Trojan horse inside European civilization. What do you mean by that?
Well, there was a period during the second century when in the West there was a church of Marcion who wanted to get rid of the Old Testament, wanted to exclude the Old Testament. In fact, possibly, we can look from their viewpoint, they didn't want to include the Old Testament because there was no canon yet, so there was no biblical canon. So it's not like the Old Testament was part of the Christian canon and they wanted to get rid of it. It's more that they created a canon without the Old Testament. And in reaction, the Catholic Church, what we call now the Catholic Church, created their own canon, including the Old Testament. And we imagine there was a lot of struggle between people who were attached to the Old Testament within Christianity, and these people were Jews, basically, or coming from a Jewish tradition. So at the second century, in the middle of the second century, that's what historians like Jerm is a good writer on that, and there's another one, I forgot his name. Well, let's say until the middle of the second century, still Christianity was basically Jewish. It was understood that it's an offshoot of Judaism, and most Christians were either Jews, Hellenistic Jews, or coming from a Jewish background. So why did Christianity keep the Old Testament? It could have turned out differently, but it turned out this way. And whether we look at it as a conspiracy or the result is that the Old Testament became a Trojan horse, in a sense that because Christianity integrated the Old Testament, then Christianity paid tribute to the Jews in the sense that they accepted the notion, the crazy notion that had always sounded completely crazy to the Romans, the crazy notion that God chose the Jews, God gave them a land, God destined them to convert to, and this kind of thing, and nobody before them knew God. That sounded completely crazy to the Romans. By the way, the Romans, the idea that the Jews invented monotheism sounded also crazy. In monotheism, the idea of one God, one supreme God, was very common. It was commonplace. We think, people didn't know there was one God. That's stupid. Everybody who was a little bit thinking knew there were many gods, but everybody knew, the divine world was unified, and there must be some, there is one God in one way or another. Cicero said this again and again. So the God was, just different ways to look at the divine world. The divine world is singular. The divine world is plural. It's masculine. It's feminine. It's so. Integrating the Old Testament meant to accept these claims of the Jewish nations, to have been the only nation in the world to whom God spoke directly, to have been the only nation who knew the real God while all other nations worshipped demons. This became part of Christianity, This became the jealous God paradigm. The jealous God means God, there's only one God, all other gods are demons. That's what God hates them and wants to destroy them. This might not have developed in the same way if the Old Testament had not been there. And then, of course, there's the Old Testament. As I study history, I can see that the influence of the Old Testament. The Old Testament was very important in political theology. No king, no emperor like Charlemagne identified to Jesus. They all identified to Moses or to Joshua. They all were full of their mission to eradicate Amalek. This language of the Old Testament, this genocidal language, became very fundamental not in the people's, the ordinary people's Christianity, but in the political theology of the rulers. And of course, it became predominant in the Crusade. The Crusades are really in the spirit of Yahweh. They're not in the spirit of Jesus at all. That's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect is that it always gave the Jews a special status, which was officially recognized by the church. As we said before, they were recognized as the witness people. You don't touch the witness people. They're there. At the end of time, they will convert, and the Messiah will come back in Jerusalem, and they will all convert, blah, blah, blah. So the Jews were preserved, protected, even privileged in many ways, because of the Old Testament, because they were the people of the Old Testament. They were special, even though, they should have recognized Jesus and so on, but still, they had a special status. They had a special aura, a special sainthood, an ambivalent sainthood, because they were both blessed and cursed. But if you study history, you can see it gave them tremendous symbolic power, in fact. And this symbolic power slowly but, transformed into political power, economic power, until we reach the 20th century, where finally Christian nations gave back Jerusalem to the Jews. The Jerusalem that the Romans had kicked out. The Jews had kicked out the Romans had kicked out the Jews from Jerusalem, had renamed Palestine, wanted to erase the Jewish nationality. Well, we gave them back Jerusalem, Israel. And today, of course, you can see, evangelical Christians in America are completely in love with Israel. They're worshipping Israel. Why? Well, because the Old Testament. If Christianity was not based on the Old Testament, that would be completely impossible.
But it sounds like you're now referring to Zionism. And can that also not be as, attributed to people like Darby and Schofield in the late 1800s?
Well, yes and no. I think it's easy to. First, of course, Christians would say, Catholics in particular would say, that's not Christianity, that's a heresy. Of course, Christian Zionism is a heresy for Catholics in particular, and for other non-Zionist Christians, it's a heresy. Okay, well, it's a heresy. Okay, but and they would bring up the Schofield Bible, which and they would point out that, well, there were some Jews, in the editorial process of that Bible. That's not false. That's true. But the bigger picture is much. You cannot just limit the influence of the Old Testament, the spirit of the Old Testament, which became so fundamental in America. America is a messianic chosen nation. They're completely Old Testament, in their imperial, in their hubris, in their sense of being chosen to bring salvation by bombs throughout the world. That's the Old Testament spirit. And also, it's a process. Christianity, there is no true Christianity for somebody like me who is not a Christian. A Christian would say, well, that's not true Christianity. True Christianity is not like this. Well, whatever. I don't care. But Christianity is what it is at any point in history. I mean, every Christian say, my Christianity is true Christianity. Yours is not, so I don't get into that debate. Yeah, that's an endless debate. There's as many Christianities as Christians, basically. But from a historian point of view, Christianity is what it is at any given time, and it evolved. And it evolved in the direction of being Israel friendly. And that's not only Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism in America. Catholicism itself at Vatican II became Jewish friendly. They accepted the Jews as their elder brothers. That's part of Vatican II in 1963, or 65, I forgot. So all Christianity slowly but was pulled in the direction of worshipping Israel, in the direction of atoning for having persecuted the Jews, of course, especially after the Holocaust. But, the Holocaust made a big difference, of course. The Holocaust religion became kind of part of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this as part of the Jewish memory, which is integral to Jewish identity.
The Holocaust.
Well, I mean, yes, of course, and you refer to that as a shallow memory.
Yeah, because the Holocaust is very biblical in the sense as the major theme of the biblical story, which is part of Jewish identity. For me, Jewishness is biblical. That's a point I refuse to consider that Jewishness is genetic. Of course, there is epigenetic phenomena, whatever. But basically, fundamentally, to be a Jew is to look at the world through the lens of the Bible. If you're an intense Jew, this becomes the lens that you see everything. If you're not an intense Jew, then might not be, the fundamental way you look at the world. But to the extent that you're a Jew, you're biblical. You look at the history of the world through the biblical lens. And the biblical lens tells you that the Jews were a superior people and a persecuted people. And God loves the Jews and hates everybody who persecutes the Jews. And ultimately, God will vindicate the Jews and destroy the nations that are against Israel. So the Jews means Israel, basically the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel for us today is a state in Palestine, but the nation of Israel for most Jews is just the eternal nation that started under Moses and still exists. Not only in Palestine, throughout the world. The diaspora has always been, since for 2,000 years, at least 2/3 of the Jews or more don't live in Palestine. They live outside. This is Israel. So the Holocaust became, kind of a new chapter in the biblical history, but it fits completely in the biblical pattern. The nations hate us, but God will destroy those nations that hate us. And they have a very long memory, and a very, they have a memory rather than a history, because they see everything through this biblical lens. It's not history really. It's a memory with a very strong pattern. And therefore, they have a strong spirit of vengeance, which you can hear. Even Netanyahu, I made an article starting from that point. Netanyahu recently was asked by one guy who's walking, and he asked, "Oh, what are you reading at this moment?" I'm reading a book called Rome Against the Jews.
Jews versus Rome.
Jews versus Rome. Forgot the name of the author.
By Barry Strauss.
Okay, yeah, I read this book, pretty good book actually.
And then Netanyahu said, "We lost that one. I think we have to win the next one."
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's not the only time he said this, and that's a typical Jewish Jews who are intense Jews have this very long memory, where they see Rome. Rome is still Christendom. Rome is the United States and Europe. And they lost against Rome, despite the fact that God had given them the empire. God told them, "You are the nation that should rule over all the nations." So they have this imperial destiny, which is a global destiny. And recently Netanyahu said, now is the time we become a regional power and a regional superpower. He said that, and even not only a regional superpower, but a global superpower. That's the biblical prophecy, And so they have this very strong sense that they will take their revenge against Rome, because Rome as an empire destroyed them, but the empire belongs to them, really, ultimately. That's the prophecy. So, that's very strong in Netanyahu, and that's very strong in this milieu of ultra-Zionists who are a little bit religious fanatics and believe that somehow God will come to their help. That's why, in fact, they are destroying Israel, because God will not come to their help, and they probably it's not going to work. But that's their very strong determination. It might work, actually. Realistically, it would not be impossible to imagine that now Israel is just about to become the regional superpower. If they beat Iran, that's what's going to happen, basically. Because they already beat Egypt. Turkey is not in a position to become the regional superpower. Saudi Arabia, no chance. They have oil, but they don't have any. So Iran is the only competitor for becoming the regional superpower, which means the empire.
Greater Israel also.
Yeah, Greater Israel and Iran are the two only candidate for becoming the new civilizational state, in a sense, and in a new multipolar world. And it's very clear that Israel, Netanyahu think now is the time we beat the Iranians and we become the empire, locally at least.
You ended off one of your articles by saying, "We are Rome now." What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, in the eyes of the Jews, we are Rome. In the eyes of Netanyahu, we are Rome, the West. So the West is an ally. I made sometime a comparison also with, and a very interesting comparison also with Donald Trump, in 2018, I think, when he gave back Jerusalem. He said he moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, right? During his first term, at the end of, I think, 2018. And then there was this whole movement calling him Cyrus, the emperor, the Persian emperor Cyrus, who in the Old Testament, in the Jewish scriptures, is called the Messiah. He's a special Messiah, the anointed. He is a kind of not a Jewish Messiah, he's a Gentile Messiah because he allowed the Jews to come back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So there was this whole messianic fervor toward Trump. Trump is a Messiah. Trump is serious. They made medals. And Netanyahu himself said to Trump, we will remember this day as we remember when Cyrus allowed the Jews to go and build up the new temple, which implicitly means now that the American embassy is in Jerusalem, the next step is we rebuild the temple. So that means in the history of Israel, there is also this important notion that Israel uses the empire to fulfill their destiny. So they use the Persian Empire. That's a very important episode in Jewish history. They used the Persian Empire to allow them to rebuild the temple, to rebuild a theocratic state, and so on. And so they view the West in a similar way. They view the United States in a similar way. We're using the United States to, first of all, give us back the state of Israel in 1947, 48, but also ultimately to rebuild the temple and ultimately to give us back our destiny to rule the Middle East. They see the United States as the empire that they are using for that, but ultimately the United States is also Rome, which they had to beat. So that's why, in fact, if we study what's going on today, we understand that Israel, Netanyahu, these kind of people, they don't care about the United States. They see now they're strong enough. They're wrong, I think. I think they're wrong. They're overblowing their own capacity. But they somehow believe, well, if the United States decline, that's fine. That's what has to happen anyway. They are not a true ally of the United States.
If the US pools all of its support for Israel and Israel gets bombed and destroyed and the Jews scatter into other countries because of the destroyed country, what happens to Christianity?
Oh, well, that's a good question. What happens to Israel is just another cycle. You know, it would be the remake of 70 AD when, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Because in fact, if America abandons Israel for some reason, which might happen, probably not soon, but there is a historical process going in that direction. Americans are really fed up now that they see they've been used by Israel, so they might at some point decide to. And also, as they learn about Kennedy's, the Kennedy's presidency, all this kind of thing, then they might get really fed up with Israel. So Israel will probably disappear. They think God will come to their help, but I don't think He will. So, what will happen to Christianity? I don't know. But I think Christianity objectively is dead in Europe. It's alive maybe in some African countries. Okay, there's all kinds of places where it's alive, and in America it's kept alive. We spoke about the Charlie Kirk story. It's very significant because it shows how much money the Jews put into American Christianity, on the condition that it stays a friend of Israel. But, if that stops, if Americans start to, I don't know, religious beliefs do not change suddenly. It takes a few generations, so, but it might die also. But the problem is, from my perspective, is that a civilization without some sense of God, some sense of transcendence, some sense of, there's something above, is a very miserable situation. And so that's why I'm also very interested in studying and talking about what Christianity destroyed, because it's not completely destroyed. It can serve again as a metaphysical frame for Western civilization, and that metaphysical frame is basically Greco-Roman philosophy, which is religious. If you ask me my religion, I say I'm a philosopher. I mean, philosophy, I'm a Stoic. Stoicism is exactly what, for example, the Chinese have in the form of Confucianism. It's both a wisdom, a religion, a philosophy. It fulfills everything you need to create a civilization. It talks about God. It talks about the cosmos. It talks about harmony, unity of all mankind. It talks about values. It talks about everything you need to create a civilization with a vertical axis.
It's funny you mentioned that. One of the most famous Stoics was a Roman emperor himself, Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah. Actually, at the time of Marcus Aurelius, 40 maybe, was anyway, middle of the 2nd century. Stoicism was really the most popular philosophy, and but Stoicism included Platonism. People were, there were different schools of philosophy, but basically people were interested in all the schools. But Stoicism was really in my view, the most accomplished philosophy. It had everything. It had a cosmology, an understanding of the cosmos, of the divine. It had logic. It developed, based on Aristotle and so on, a very strong sense of reason, so it had a scientific dimension, and it had a metaphysical and an ethical dimension, which was extremely inspiring, because it's an ethical teaching that teaches you, if you understand how things work, you understand how to be a factor of harmony. You understand how to be part of the cosmos means harmony, and for the Stoics, cosmos is God, basically, because God is basically the principle of order and harmony in the world. So based on that, you have something very powerful. To me and to many people, Stoicism is very popular today. Unfortunately, popular Stoicism is a little bit, most of the time, a little bit erasing the metaphysical dimension, which is in fact the foundation, so it's, the popular Stoicism emphasizes overcome your emotion and these kind of things, which is not bad, but it's good in the sense that there is an awareness that there is a wealth of wisdom in Stoicism. And in fact, if you study that period of Marcus Aurelius, you can see that the Roman Empire could have made Stoicism like an official philosophy, exactly as China did at some point with Confucianism. In the sense that Confucianism became official wisdom. You had to be a Confucianist to become a functionary, to work in the state. You had to study Confucius. You had to show that you are, a man of Confucian wisdom to become part of the state. So that could have evolved in that direction. That's interesting to think what could have happened. Then, of course, the Roman Empire would not have needed Christianity. In other words, instead of having a Constantine converting to Christianity, we could have had a Constantine converting to Stoicism and kind of, promoting Stoicism as the universal wisdom of the empire. That would have been, that's unimaginable.
If somebody were to walk away from this conversation, what, in a nutshell, would you like them to walk away with?
Well, first of all, I'm trying to talk to people who have the same sense that Christianity is a problem. So I don't want to disturb Christians who need Christianity. I prefer they don't read or listen to me because, I don't want to disturb people in their faith. But many people are like me. They are religious. I mean, they feel we need some kind of religion, But I also understand Christianity is dead. They cannot believe Jesus came out of his tomb. They cannot believe he was born of the Virgin. So in fact, they're not Christian in a strict sense. But some of them feel, well, without Christianity, what do I have? So I'm trying to give these people a sense first that Christianity is really a problem. It's part of the Jewish question. The flip side of it is the Christian question. It's really a big part of it. And when you understand the Jewish question, when you understand the problem of Israel in the world, and how can you not understand, that Israel is a huge problem in the world? How can you not see this is a sociopathic nation? It's a nation which is possessed by an evil god, an evil demon, So when you start to see like this, you understand there is a very deep problem. This problem is deeply within Christianity. So we have to solve that problem. But to solve that problem, we have to find something else. And to find something else, we have to understand the process of Christianization. What happened? Did Christianity appear out of nowhere and because Roman tradition was dead? No, we have to study that and see it was a religious war against a tradition which was very much alive and rich, and we have to find, study this. So I think one of the best things to do is to really study Stoicism, for example. And also study the Renaissance. I think it's kind of together, because then if you study the Renaissance, you understand that the greatness of our civilization is not based on Christianity. It is based on the Renaissance, which is a rediscovery of this tremendous wealth of wisdom, science, metaphysics, of the Greco-Roman world. So rediscover the Greco-Roman tradition. That would be my advice. And if you want to take a shortcut, just go straight to the Stoicism. It's a great tradition.
How can I follow your work?
Well, at this moment, if you can check my book on Amazon. My Yahweh, From Yahweh to Zion, is a book that kind of it's a little bit big, but that's maybe a good approach. There's another one called Our God is Your God Too, but He has chosen us. It gets into it's kind of a continuation of From Yahweh to Zion. But at this moment, you can follow me on my Substack called Radbod's Lament, where I write one article basically every 2 weeks. At this moment, continuing on the Christianization, problem of Christianity, and then when I finish, I will move to something else. But that's how you can follow my work. So thank you very much, Jerm, for this invitation, and I appreciate the opportunity to try to share my research.
Laurent, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for joining me in the trenches.